best place to hide the truth is in the pages of a book.
Maybe we should just read. Maybe we should just read.
Welcome to Hayes Reviews. Hello and welcome back to another episode. This is Nick. I am the creator of this channel, and we are here to read books, to do some learning, and to get a grip on just what the is going on in the world. It's good to be back. I've had a busy week. It's been sunny here. The weather's been kind. The spraying has been less, although it's still going on. And I've been looking after my mum's dog for the last few days and taking her out on lots of walks and just soaking up that boundless, never-ending adoration that you get from a young dog which you feed and walk regularly. It's a wonderful thing to be witness to, just that unconditional love, that excitement. You go out of the room for 10 minutes, you come back in, the tail's wagging, she's jumping up, she's saying hello, she's climbing all over you, nibbling your face, licking your elbow, and it's just a wonderful, uplifting, energizing experience to have a young puppy around like that. So I've been enjoying that this week, but that's not what you're here to hear me talk about, I am sure. Tonight we are continuing with our reading of Fabian Freeway. We have finished part 1, and we are embarking upon part 2, the second part of the book. I think there's only 2 parts in the book, if memory serves. Let me just check that quickly. I want to fact check myself in real time. Yes, the book consists of 2 parts, but the first part is the shortest by a long shot. We've done the first, so roughly 100 pages now. That's part 1. That's wrapped up. And we're embarking upon part 2, and that's going to be the next 300 pages is part 2. So welcome back, and it's wonderful to have you here if you're watching live. Equally wonderful to have you here if you're catching up on the replay. It's just a wonderful thing in general to have anybody tuning in and learning from these books. I love the books. I love collecting them. I love buying them, reading them. I love knowing that I have them preserved and I can pick them up and check things out anytime. And there's nothing that Google or AI or Facebook or Zuckerberg or Bezos or any of these evil tyrant, Schwab, Musk, none of them can come between me and the books that I have on my shelves over there. And that gives me a great sense of security because I can always refer to them to get some awareness about what's going on in the world and how we ended up in the situation that we're in. And this book has been a tour de force of helping us understand just how and why we are in the situation that we're in. And it is blowing my mind, this book. It really is. Every chapter that we've read so far has had just incredible nuggets, threads to pull on, names to research, and facts to look up. And other books have been recommended as well. There's a bibliography at the back. And I haven't even started to look into whether or not these books are still available or expensive or cheap or whatnot. I have massively blown my book budget for this month, so I'm resisting. I'm holding off on doing that searching until next month, until after next payday. So it's been a really good read so far. So first thing first, I want to shout out Frank, LJ, Gwen, CESP, Amanda. Good evening. I'm very glad to have you all here back again. You are the stalwart companions as we go through these books, and I'm deeply grateful to have you here on this journey. It's wonderful that you're in the chat and talking to each other and adding comments and context and giving me resources, and I'm learning things, and we've got a good synergistic return going on here. You know, I'm here doing what I do, and you're over there doing what you do on your end, and together it kind of creates this really nice community vibe built around learning, curiosity, built around moving forward with our understanding of the world so that we can communicate it to other people, so that when our loved ones, friends, colleagues, co-workers go to the voting box and have a finger wagging morally superior go at you for not voting Labour in the next round of selections, you can say, well, did you know that? Do you know about the Fabian Society? What do you know about them? Have you heard of them before? What about that window that they had made? Oh, you don't know about that? Oh, interesting. Well, shame you don't know about that. I've got just the right thing to help you learn about that. And I'm going to show you what that is now. So here on my YouTube channel, if you are having that conversation, you find yourself in the throes of being judged by a Labour voter, perhaps you could point them this way, to the Hayes Reviews YouTube channel. You could send them also to Rumble and Odyssey, because these clips are also on there. But what I've been doing over the last week is making some shorter clips between 2 minutes, and the longest one there is about 13 minutes. Many people don't have the attention span for the longer form content. So what I've been doing is clipping out little bits, editing them so that they're very punchy. There's not as much of me hesitating, umming, ahhing, grasping for words. All this stuff is edited out. So it's just all killer, no filler. And then I've put in some I've put in some pictures to illustrate what we're talking about, and also some other clips. The one that seems to be getting the most views and popping off, well, not popping off, but it's getting the most views, is this one here, which is the video, 7-minute video I did on the British Labour Party are wolves in sheep's clothing, ? This one I think you could send out to any Labour voters you may know, because this is amazing information that it really blew my mind. And I think anybody who is going to vote for this group of politicians should be aware of this history about that group that they're voting for, the legacy that is in place that they are born from. People should know about this, right? And so you can send them to my YouTube channel if you would like to help them learn a little bit about that. Those clips are there, and I'm intending to make more clips, and I will make more clips maybe this weekend. I'm not so sure. It's actually pretty time consuming. It can be upwards of 4 or 5 hours to edit maybe a 10-minute clip. But it's really, once I start doing it, I get in the zone. I get really obsessed with it, and I get so in the zone that I get grumpy if anyone interrupts me, or I have to, my attention gets diverted into something else. But that's what they are there for. It's for sharing, and then underneath each one is a link to the bigger full-length stream. So have at it. Send them out to people. You never know. They might tell you to piss off and stop sharing things with them, or they might learn something. So that's one thing you can do. Other thing on the YouTube channel to have a look at is the playlists tab. This is where we've got all the playlists of all the books we have read. I don't need to recap those. You probably all know about them by now if you're here watching us today. So, but another good place to send people if they're interested in learning a bit and they can't be bothered to buy and read books themselves. You can listen to me do it. That's what I'm here for. Next thing is allmylinks.com/Hayes Reviews has all my links on it, which are all here, and I'm sure you all know them by now as well. So let's move on from that. I don't have much in the way of an introduction for you this evening. I thought we would just get straight into the reading because these chapters are packed. The last video was 3 hours Tuesday night, and by the end of it, it was turning into this kind of stamina exercise. So I thought tonight we'd just jump into the book, start reading. But I do have a little treat to give you before we actually get into the book itself, and we'll head over to the book cam right now to have a look at this little treat. So you might realize, if you are eagle-eyed and you've been here recently watching some of the previous streams from this book, that the cover has changed. I didn't have this cover on this book before. So what happened was, as I was preparing to go live with part 1 of this series, I thought I would look quickly online and just check what is the kind of price point for this book at the moment and how many copies are available. Because it's part of what I do is keep an eye on the books that I'm into to keep just to check to see if the price is going up, if it's going down, if there's more availability on the market, if there's less. And every so often I snag bargains. And so I got another bargain, which is over here on my shelf, which is just a second copy of this book. It's not signed, but it's another first edition, 1966. And this copy came with this dust cover. And so I thought I would put this dust cover on my first edition signed copy to protect it. And I actually got that one over there for about £12 something, which is an absolute bargain. If you go and have a look, copies of this go for up £60 dollars and up, all the way up to over 100. So as soon as I saw that, I just grabbed it and got it sent here, and I was really happy. But the nice thing about that I get to share with you is the dust cover has some information about our intrepid and wonderful author, Rose Martin. And I don't know why, but it hadn't occurred to me to do any background reading on the author herself and present that to you. It would have been a good thing to do, and perhaps we'll still do it. But what I noticed here in this dust cover is we've got a little kind of blurb in the front, and we've also got a bit of blurb on the back page as well. And I thought we would just do, by way of intro, a read through of that. And I haven't even read it yet. So I saved it for you, in other words. Imagine the restraint involved in saving this just so that we could read it together on the stream tonight. So this is Fabian Freeway, High Road to Socialism in the USA by Rose L. Martin. So, more than 10 years ago, Rose L. Martin resolved to tackle a huge and forbidding job that, if well done, would render a valuable service to sane thinking and national survival. It was a job as stimulating and awesome and as fraught with pitfalls and dangers as many an espionage assignment overseas. It was a do-it-yourself sleuthing job that would require seemingly endless months of painstaking reading and research and of running down organizational tie-ins, obscure references, names. It would require a self-starter, someone who saw a job that had to be done, someone with nerve and initiative. There were no paychecks, nothing to look forward to, but hardship. The assignment? Dig out the facts concerning one of the best kept and most jealously guarded secrets of modern days. How Fabian socialism, which is socialism by stealth and secrecy and suaveness, was developed in Great Britain for exportation in strength to the United States. This book reveals the surprising number of Fabian socialists now in high places in the US government and, even at the moment of its publication, calls for another book to continue the huge job of identifying the socialists in federal appointive and elective positions, as well as those elsewhere in prestigious US organizations. Does Rose Martin say that there were no communists involved in this whole British development for US import? Certainly not. Theoretically, all Fabians could be communists. But in any case, Fabians had evolved an effective means of injecting socialism into the US through our Anglo-Saxon tradition via Britain in the most palatable way. Where does Fabian socialism lead? This book reveals the shocking answer. It has no place to go but to communism, unless it is stopped. Rose Martin has written a political commentary in a style that is masterly, well-documented, lucid, and directly to the point. About the author. Rose L. Martin is first and foremost a writer. In 1924, immediately after graduating from college, she began writing a daily column as a radio critic for the New York Herald Tribune. Simultaneously, and until 1940, she wrote scores of articles on special assignment for the New York Times, the Trib, the Houston Post, the Baltimore Sun, the National Editorial Association, and other media. Most frequently, she wrote for the Times, sometimes daily pieces, but more often Sunday supplement color features, interviews. She wrote many times book reviews under the review editorship of J. Donald Adams. Her signed articles first appeared under the name Rose Lee, later R.L. Martin, both familiar bylines to Times readers. As time went on, she wrote for Century Magazine, Mentor, and others. In In 1938, she authored a series of articles on Mexican oil expropriations that appeared in the Baltimore Sun and that were quoted editorially by the Saturday Evening Post. There was a reporting assignment from the Sun to the Pan American Conference in Lima, Peru. An article, Watch Out for Panama, appeared in the August 1939 Atlantic Monthly. A special enthusiasm of Mrs. Martin's and a frequent assignment was writing and reporting on aviation. An example, her article in the Times Special Aviation Supplement in 1953 celebrating the 50th anniversary of powered flight. Her assignments always have been varied and impressive. During and following World War II, Mrs. Martin wrote aviation PR material and Army Air Force recruiting material, did both article and speech ghostwriting for Washington luminaries, traveled and wrote for Air Force magazine. At one point, she planned and wrote all state and national campaign publicity for the New York State Republican women. She also had her own public relations office in Washington. Since 1962, Rose Martin has devoted herself exclusively to research and writing on the subject of international socialism. Fabian Freeway, which puts a finger on the master plan for converting Britain and the United States into socialist countries in a worldwide socialist association controlled by communists, is her first, but we hope it will not be her last, book-length contribution to this important field. And the other thing as well to note on here on the inside flap is the price. $9.65 back in 1966. And it looks like someone's crossed that out and put 45, either 45 pence or £4.50 or £4.05. I'm not sure. So that is my new and improved and updated copy of Fabian Freeway. Yeah, great intro there. And summarizes very nicely the concept and the idea behind the book. So we finished part one. I'll do a quick summary of that in my own words, because one of the things that I find challenging when I read is trying to summarize what I've read in a way that I can communicate it out to other people. Because books have so much detail. There's names, there's dates, references to other books, a lot of information which is extraneous when you're trying to communicate to other people the gist of what it is that you've learned. And so I think one of the skills that we want to practice as readers and learners is how to succinctly communicate what we've read to other people so that they can get the message without having to go through the hours and hours of reading and learning that we ourselves have gone through. That's the essence of being a teacher. That's the essence of sharing knowledge, which is wisdom. When you have knowledge and information and you put it together and you share it out with other people, that's wisdom. And so we're in that game, that process of getting the information and the knowledge and then sharing it out as wisdom to other people. And so I'll have a crack at summarizing part one before we dive into part two, because we're at part two now. So now we're at the part of the story where we're going to learn how this British-born socialism was exported to the USA. And I know that I have audience members in the USA, and so it's going to be very useful and interesting for you, I'm sure, and you'll probably recognize the names and the places and the events with more familiarity than I will as a Brit. But part one basically told us about how the group started. And there was a small group of middle-class people, and they got together, and I think they were kind of bored, and they had a sense of purposelessness. They were atheist. They'd been brought up with the Darwinian view where the world has no meaning because we all just evolved from space dust and there's no purpose or design behind it all. And therefore, the highest purpose is really just the satisfaction and the happiness of your own desires. And you get to make up what is important and what you should do with your life. And in essence, it's relativity. And so they were sitting around kind of bored with no meaning or purpose. And they started to go to meetings together. And a lot of them were the recipients of money that had been left to them in wills. Relatives have died, and so they didn't have to work. And they were very much aligned with the reading and the writing of Karl Marx and Lenin and these communist thinkers. And so it seems that they started to think about how they could bring communism around into a world that didn't have it and didn't want it. Particularly, this was Britain in the sort of late 1800s and early 1900s. They seemed to be very sympathetic to the communist way and the worldview of communism. And I think they themselves didn't want to work. They didn't want to work hard. They were sort of elitist in that they looked down upon the working class and the servant class, and they felt that they probably bought into this social Darwinism, whereby if you're not super rich and successful and you hold on to that for multiple generations, then you're not really worthy of keeping around. And so George Bernard Shaw, who was one of the founding members of the Fabian Society and in fact designed their window, their famous stained glass window, which tells you everything you need to know about this group, he was in favor of panels, and these panels would pass judgment on people as to whether or not their organization of a big society would continue to support their lives. So he said, and I put this clip in one of my shorter videos, people should have to come before a panel and justify their existence. And if they can't, fill in the blank, ... Basically, if they can't, then we kill them. And he says there are a huge number of people I would like to kill. That's his quote, and he's on video saying that. So this is the sort of mindset of these people. And from these early days, these early meetings, they decided to be inspired and name themselves after I think a Roman general, Fabius something or other, and he was famous for being extremely patient. And so they decided to enact their plans over the long term. They took the symbol of the tortoise, which was a slow, plodding creature, but it beat the hare in the fable because it didn't stop. It just kept going at a steady pace, whereas the hare was cocky and arrogant and stopped for a nap, and the tortoise overtook and won the race while the hare was napping. And so they took this symbol, they took the symbol of the wolves in sheep's clothing, which is a symbol of duplicity, of lying. This is a symbol of predation, dressing yourself up as something sweet and innocent and harmless, when in actual fact you're a predator, you're a carnivore, and you're looking to kill and prey upon the weaker members of the pack, the human herd, in other words. I think the idea of a wolf in sheep's clothing tells you everything, because from that point on, they went to infiltrate and permeate and penetrate small groups. They started with labor unions, and they had working men's groups, and then they got all these groups together to form a new political party in the UK, which became the British Labour Party. That party was then used to topple the Liberal Party, and it went from third place to second place to first place, Rose Martin tells us. And then it got in power for 6 years between, I think it was 1944 to 1951, during which time they nationalized a whole bunch of stuff. They added massive amounts of bureaucracy and form filling, and they grew this unproductive bureaucratic class of people who became the only ones that benefited from these socialist policies, where everybody else was struggling with all the red tape, with all the hoops that they were made to then jump through, with all the top-down government control, giving out permits, doling out resources, controlling who gets what. It just became a 6-year period of stagnation, and the productive inclinations of the working class were massively dampened and inhibited by this group of people. So their first attempt at control and running the country lasted 6 years before they were sent packing, at which point the main Fabians in the society began this lifestyle of jet setting around the world and carrying out research and looking for other places and other opportunities where they could roll out their plans and schemes with a view to gaining control of the means of production. And they want to tell you that it's, well, you know, no individual can own the means of production. The means of production have to belong to everybody. But of course, we have to sit at the top of that and dole it out and control it and make sure everybody gets what they deserve. So that's my summary of part one. I hope that was useful and made sense. If I've missed anything out, chuck it in the chat there. It's tricky to summarize 8 chapters worth of dense reading material, but I had a go. Let me know how I did. You can give me marks out of 10 or maybe a grade. So we'll just have a quick view of the comments before we get into the book. LJ, another dog lover. She sends greetings from her dog who's 13 years old and still the same. Still enthusiastic and still full of energy and love and unconditional adoration for you, I'm sure. Gwen says, you can see that I've caught the sun. Yeah, I've been out 4 times yesterday, 3 times today already. Gwen says, when her dog greeted her, he jumped out and knocked out a tooth. And you had to go to the dentist the next day. That is enthusiastic, unconditional love for you right there. The dog loves you so much, it knocked out a tooth. LJ said, I shared the short one on Fabian's and chocolate. And he loved it. That's awesome. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, so the reference there, and if people haven't seen the previous videos or that short clip, is that Edward Pease, who was a founding member of the Fabian Socialist and in whose house the first group got together, they held their first meeting in his house. His mother was a descendant of the Fry family, of Fry's Turkish Delight fame. And Fry's, they were chocolatiers. They had this chocolate business, which would be an interesting piece of history to learn more about, because that will be connected to slavery, no doubt, because it's cocoa and cocoa plantations and sugar production. Sugar was one of the first drivers of slavery. In fact, the cultivation of sugar, when that was first introduced, it's basically a drug, isn't it? Pure refined sugar is kind of addictive. It gives you that high and that crash. And so sugar was a huge driver of slavery back in the day, as was many other products. So it'd be interesting to know the Fry's family links to the slavery and how dirty their hands are. But an unusual and unexpected link, I thought, when we learned that from Wikipedia. That's just public knowledge. That's not anything weird or conspiracy theory or out there or crazy. That's just on Wikipedia. Tells you the founding member of the Fabian Society's mother is from the Fry family. They eventually merged with Cadbury, which is a famous chocolate manufacturer, I think in the UK, but maybe internationally as well. And just think of all the pain and suffering and struggle and disease and death caused by an over-reliance and an addiction to sugar. It is ubiquitous. It's all over. It's everywhere. It's really hard to escape and live without sugar, especially if you have to eat on the move or if you eat out a lot, if you travel a lot. Everything has sugar in it. And just think about the obesity crises that we face, the diabetes, the addictive quality of this substance and how it just ruins people. And I have a book, actually. I'll grab it. If I can remember where it is. There it is. This one. We'll put it on the book cam. Pure, White and Deadly, How Sugar is Killing Us and What We Can Do to Stop It, by John Yudkin. And it says up here, the classic medical expose. And this is actually first published in the 70s, I think. Yeah, so this is copyright 1972. 1972. And then updated in 1986. With another update in the 2012 version, which I think this is the 2012 version. But 1972, this gentleman, John Yudkin, was writing and wrote a book and a study about how sugar is incredibly addictive and damaging and harmful to our health. And yet it is really, really incredibly difficult to avoid. They put it in meat. You get these flavored maybe burgers or pieces of steak with sauce on. Sugar. It's just absolutely everywhere. And yet we've known since the 70s that it's incredibly damaging and addictive and harmful to our health to consume too much of it. So the links between sugar production, chocolate production, and then Fabian socialism would be very interesting to explore, but we'll have to save that for a future video. And LJ says, sugar feeds cancer. So if you wonder, you see all this like, we got to collect all this money because we need to cure cancer, and together we're going to beat cancer, and we're fighting cancer. Just give us more money. We'll get it soon. But they never talk about this connection between sugar and how cancerous cells feed on carbohydrate, right? So Gwen says she's read this book and it made her think, and then she gave up sugar, and that was 4 years ago. Fantastic. Congratulations, Gwen. That's really great news and very inspirational, particularly to me, because I'm also in the process of trying to get rid of sugar, and I'm doing pretty well. But whenever I lapse and I have an indulgent moment and I eat something and have a bunch of sugar and it jacks up my blood sugar level, I crash and I feel terrible for 2 or 3 days afterwards. Literally, like I called it an ice cream come down. And back in the day, in the raving days, you might have taken some substances and you have this big high on the night at the party, and then afterwards you got to come down. Same with alcohol, you go up and then you come down, you have the hangover. Sugar has the same thing. It does the same thing to you. So if you take a massive amount of sugar and then you don't take any more, to keep your blood sugar topped up over the days after, then you actually experience or I at least experience this massive come down, and I'm depressed and moody and I'm irritable and low energy and lethargic and all this other horrible stuff that I don't want to be. So I'm being very careful and cautious now with my sugar intake, and definitely avoiding big binging sort of. I like 2 weeks ago I had a whole like pot of ice cream to myself because I was like, oh well, I've been really good all week. I'm just gonna treat myself, eat all this ice cream, and I felt terrible for 2 days. So don't sign up to the ice cream come down. It is not something I recommend. Okay. I think that's it for intro and chatter. Let's get into the book. That's why we're all here. That's what we all want to learn. We don't want to listen to Nick chatter on about ice cream and sugar. We want to learn from Rose Martin, the intrepid and wonderful, generous and kind. Because I always think of authors that as just being some of the most generous and kind people. The amount of time that they have to sacrifice, the amount of effort and energy that goes in, the dedication, the diligent, patient research and learning to create these artifacts for us to preserve and transfer this information out into the future, not even knowing who's going to read it or when or if anyone's going to read it. It's an incredible service to humanity. And so I always have a great deal of respect for people. And then if the book's a humdinger like this one is, I have an even extra level of respect, because when it's incredible information of the quality and caliber that we're getting here, it just blows my mind. So let's get into it. Chapter 9. The Fabian Turtle Discovers America. Shortly after the new year in 1888, a shy, frail, and previously undiscovered young American awoke to a new life. For the next 10 years until his death at the age of 48, he was not only to experience the rewards of literary success, but to be acclaimed as the lay prophet of a new and fashionable political cult. His name, Edward Bellamy, would soon be known from Massachusetts to California, and even in such world capitals as London, Paris, and Berlin. The reason? One of the most ingenious manuscripts ever received by Benjamin Tickner of the Boston publishing firm Lee and Shepherd had just been published over Bellamy's signature, and it proved to be the best-selling American novel since Uncle Tom's Cabin. I've never even heard of Uncle Tom's Cabin, so anybody in the chat read that? Should I rush out and buy a copy? I'm kidding, I haven't got any time to read novels. I've got a lot to read first. Edward Bellamy was a former editorial writer and book reviewer who appeared to have been something of a drifter. Son of a New England minister, he had studied for a few terms at Union College in Schenectady, and then spent a year in Dresden, Germany, where he pursued an already awakened interest in socialism. Everything he started seemed to be cut short, either by illness or his own restless temperament, for Bellamy suffered intermittently from tuberculosis, that plague of early America. Returning from Europe, Bellamy prepared for the bar, but practiced only briefly. Instead, he went to New York City with a letter of recommendation from Colonel Thomas Wentworth Higginson, the well-known abolitionist and latter-day socialist, and began writing for the New York Evening Post. When he was only 22, Bellamy delivered a lyceum address on the barbarism of competitive industry and the beauties of a socialized system, which apparently resulted in his leaving New York and joining the staff of the Springfield Union. Yeah, so this idea of writing on the barbarism of competitive industry, this is a really key part of socialism leading to communism. And I think Frank's mentioned in the Telegram chat before that David Rockefeller also had some very disparaging words to say about competition, which basically summed up to, let's get rid of it. And if you get rid of competition, then you're just left with a monopoly. But of course, that is what socialism, which leads to communism, is aiming for, is a complete monopoly over everything at all times, with a small group of people controlling it and telling you that they have to do that because science is, and they're scientists, and they've got white coats and algorithms, and therefore we all have to do what they say. Poor health made regular work difficult, but an early retirement brought Bellamy the fame that had so far escaped him. Though he had published some 24 short stories in respected American magazines of the day, his circle of admirers was small. Settling down in the little cotton mill town where he was born and fortifying himself with generous infusions of whiskey and black coffee, he produced several novels that gained him but slight attention. At last, he wrote Looking Backward, the tale of an American utopia and a singularly effective piece of propaganda for a non-American doctrine. Like many another popular novel, it was not destined to become a classic. By now it remains little more than a literary curiosity, buried in libraries throughout the world and resurrected only occasionally. A briefer edition, reprinted in the 1930s, gives hardly a clue to its original impact. When the book first appeared, however, it was noted for its novelty and for the fact that it was a socialist romance which never once mentioned socialism. A book review of March 29, 1888 in The Nation, then owned by the New York Evening Post, where Bellamy had been a contributor, did not hesitate to mention the proscribed word. Hailing the work as a glowing prophecy and gospel of peace, the anonymous critic added that even if Bellamy's schemes for solving the land question, quote, ought theoretically to have restored the society of ancient Peru instead of bringing about the millennium, Mr. George himself would rejoice in a realized ideal of socialism such as this. The Mr. George referred to was, of course, Henry George, author of Progress and Poverty, who had run unsuccessfully for mayor of New York City less than 2 years before and polled the surprising total of 67,000 votes, 7,000 more than a muscular young Republican named Theodore Roosevelt. As the Nation's reviewer noted, the brand of socialism offered in fiction-coated form by Bellamy was stronger medicine than any prescribed by Henry George, who urged a single tax on land as a remedy for humanity's ills. Looking Backward predicted that America's golden age would be achieved not merely by making real estate unprofitable, but by making all other investments equally unprofitable. The marvel was to be wrought, presumably by peaceful means, through, quote, the national organization of labor under a single direction. For, like its predecessor, Uncle Tom's Cabin, which had sparked anti-slavery agitation in New England, Looking Backward was abolitionist in spirit. In the most polite and indirect way, it preached to the questing Puritan conscience the abolition of, quote, wage slavery. There was nothing accidental about it, as some biographers assert today. Okay, let me rewrite. There was nothing accidental about it, as some biographers assert today. In the same year that Edward Bellamy began writing his long-projected utopian novel, Karl Marx's daughter, Eleanor, George Bernard Shaw's Dark Lady, Okay, so that's a footnote I want to look at, which says Hesketh Pearson has a book called Bernard Shaw from 1961. And I suppose that book tells us that Bernard Shaw referred to Karl Marx's daughter as Dark Lady. And remember the link between Karl Marx and Luciferianism or Satanism. And I can't remember exactly the quote, but it was something along the lines of never serve, wasn't it? This quote about wasn't it Lucifer's words before he was cast out of heaven was that he would never serve God, and therefore he was cast out of heaven and then sent down to reign in hell. And Karl Marx had a similar sort of position. So that kind of links to his daughter being named Dark Lady, continuing that sort of imagery of sort of Luciferianism, Satanism, demons, and dark inverted angels and devils and that kind of thing. Karl Marx's daughter Eleanor toured the United States, noticed a great deal of, quote, unconscious socialism, and announced that someday, quote, the Uncle Tom's Cabin of Capitalism would be written. A mutual friend, Lawrence Gronlund, transmitted the word to Bellamy with a further specification that the book should be designed to attract persons of, quote, judgment and culture. 5 other utopian novels were published in 1888, but Bellamy's was the only one to be promoted by a clique of socialist-tinged intellectuals, even then in the process of formation. Though its popularity waned as fashions in fiction changed, the long-range movement it served to launch has persisted in various related forms for some 3/4 of a century. Julian West, the hero of Looking Backward, was a properly well-to-do Bostonian of the type Bellamy and Gronlund hoped to reach. In 2000 AD, Julian awoke from a long hypnotic sleep to find that the United States had evolved painlessly into something called the Cooperative Commonwealth, where everyone was happy, comfortable, and behaved like an angel. Looking backward, he was able to detect many flaws in the society of his birth and to perceive that they had all been corrected by the new collectivist system. It was, as the British social evangelist William Morris rather snobbishly remarked, quote, a Cockney paradise, which he personally would not care to inhabit. Sweetened by a sentimental love interest, this optimistic fantasy appealed to America's kindly, culture-hungry middle class in an era when the routine of daily life was brightened by the lend-a-hand clubs and the Chautauqua circles. So this sounds to me like an inverted 1984. 1984 by George Orwell tells you what the plan actually is, and it has that romance story as well, doesn't it, between Winston and Julia, whereas this gives you this sort of fictionalized promise of what it is. It sounds like this novel, Looking Backward, gives you the sheep version of what socialism is, whereas Orwell's 1984 gives you the reality, the wolf version of what socialism actually is. For a time, Looking Backward sold at the then fantastic rate of 1,000 copies a day. Total sales in the United States eventually topped 500,000 and in England reached nearly half that amount. As a result, Edward Bellamy became the figurehead and symbol of an American Fabian socialist movement whose future pattern of growth he could not foresee in detail. British Fabians, however, and their disciples in the United States were available to guide its development, from the eager beginnings to the grim conclusion, which a veteran American socialist, Upton Sinclair, assures us blithely was never closer than it is today. Lee and Shepard, original publishers of Looking Backward, were promptly besieged with questions about its unknown author. Among others, Frances E. Willard, then heading the very respectable National Council of Women in Washington, D.C., wrote to a friend employed by the firm, quote, have been reading Edward Bellamy's Looking Backward and think it's a revelation and an evangel. Who and where is he? What manner of man is he in private? To which she received the reply, quote, we do not know, except that his letters are mailed from Chicopee Falls, Massachusetts, end quote. 3 weeks later, Frances Willard, ever an ardent advocate of women's causes, wrote to say, quote, some of us think that Edward Bellamy must be Edwardina, that a big-hearted, big-brained woman wrote the book. Won't you please find out? As the moving spirit of the International Women's Christian Temperance Union, Frances E. Willard was a lifelong intimate of English temperance leader Lady Henry Somerset and a perennial house guest at her country estate. Like a number of early American feminists and reformers, Frances Willard also joined the Fabian Society of London. Though disappointed to learn that the author of Looking Backward was no female, her enthusiasm for the novel was not diminished. Frances Willard quickly brought it to the attention of British friends and claimed credit for introducing the book to students at Oxford. Besides commending it to many lecture audiences in America, in a face-to-face discussion, Bellamy even persuaded her that references to after-dinner wine and cigars in the year 2000 were permissible, since by then the curse of intemperance would have been safely removed. In private life, Edward Bellamy was addicted to stronger beverages than wine, but his frequent inability to appear in public was usually ascribed to dyspepsia. He was no less guarded about revealing the origins of his socialist creed. In a letter to William Dean Howells, the silver-haired New England poet and essayist, he stated, quote, "I have never been a student of socialist literature or have known more of socialist schemes than any reader of newspapers might." This careful denial may be doubted, for Bellamy was a voracious reader of German as well as English books. In his Lyceum Address of 1872, he had already shown more than a bowing acquaintance with socialist doctrines. To others, he confessed that he learned all he knew of scientific socialism from a little volume by Lawrence Gronlund, a Danish-American lawyer then living in Philadelphia. It was called the Cooperative Commonwealth, a term that modern socialists still use interchangeably with the term, quote, industrial democracy, given currency some years later by Sidney and Beatrice Webb. Published in 1884 also by Lee and Shepard, The Cooperative Commonwealth was the first book deliberately to present the doctrines of Marxian socialism in non-Marxist terms for American readers. 4 years later, Gronlund ordered his own work withdrawn from circulation in order to help promote the sales of his friend Bellamy's novel, a rare example of literary altruism. Educated in Europe, Lawrence Gronlund was already a full-blown Marxist when he emigrated to the United States. As a lawyer, teacher, and would-be labor organizer in this country, he had come to the conclusion that neither European methods nor an alien terminology could ever succeed in making socialism acceptable to the great majority of Americans. Social revolution must be disguised. It must be a gradualist movement for social reform. Perhaps it was not purely by coincidence that a similar idea occurred at precisely the same time to the founders of the London Fabian Society. This idea coincided with the long-term plan for England and America of the two tireless arch-conspirators, Karl Marx and Frederick Engels, from whom modern social democracy stems. As early as 1872, Karl Marx, speaking in Amsterdam, had intimated that social revolution might be accomplished by peaceful means in England and America. That is, by taking advantage of libertarian traditions and free institutions to subvert them. Both countries were well known to Marx and had treated him kindly. London was his home during years of exile. There he set up the first international, known as the Working Men's International Association, on September the 28th, 1864, at a public meeting in St. Martin's Hall, Longacre. While Marx never visited the United States, the weekly $5 which he received as a special correspondent for the New York Tribune was for a time his chief source of income. He sent articles on the Crimean War to that newspaper, whose editor, Horace Greeley, likewise called himself a socialist, although Greeley seems to have perceived little difference between the utopian farm colonies inspired in antebellum America by Charles Fourier and Robert Owen and the, quote, scientific socialism of a Karl Marx. The father of modern social democracy believed that in certain respects the United States held the key to world revolution. In the preface to Volume 1 of Das Kapital, Marx wrote, quote, "As in the 18th century, the American War of Independence sounded the tocsin for the European middle class. The American Civil War sounded it for the European working class." Following the collapse of the Paris Commune, which he had backed after its formation, Marx ordered the headquarters of his First International transferred to New York City in 1872 under the direction of a trusted aide, Friedrich Adolf Sorge, maybe? 70 years later, a grandson of that selfsame Sorge headed a communist spy ring in Tokyo, whose intrigues precipitated the Japanese decision to strike southward at Pearl Harbor and brought the United States into World War II in time to save communist Russia. In his lifetime, Karl Marx freely deplored the fact that his socialist followers in the United States were no more than a displaced group of angry trade unionists, refugees from the revolutions of 1848 and 1870. Their meetings were held and minutes were written in German. Socially, politically, and psychologically, they were not only isolated from the main current of American life, but for years they rebuffed attempts by English-speaking socialists to join them. Lawrence Gronlund, his friends Charles Sutherland, the biographer of Horace Greeley, and Florence Kelly, who translated Engels' Condition of the Working Class in England in 1844, were expelled in turn from America's Socialist Labour Party for being unorthodox and non-German. A British Fabian socialist and charter member of the London Fabian Society, Edward R. Pease, once observed tartly that the early social democrats in the United States resembled some small dogmatic sect whose every action required a Marxian text to sanctify it. For years, this remained the characteristic mood of working-class socialism in America. Though the General German Working Men's Union and the Socialist Labour Party made some temporary headway in centres for immigrant population, notably New York City, where the slogan, quote, "Down with German socialism and German lager," became a war cry of Tammany Hall. Engels remarked in a private letter to Sorge that the disappearance of the stubborn, unruly old German comrades would be a healthy thing for the socialist movement in America. Revolutions and barricades, dynamite and rifles were all the talk among the German-American Marxists of the 80s, and anybody who suggested anything else was unworthy of the name of socialist. The decade had been a stormy one for the comrades. In Russia, social revolutionaries conspired to kill grand dukes and ministers of state, and in 1882 had actually succeeded in assassinating the Tsar. In Chicago, 3 German-American anarchists and 1 Native American, Albert Parsons, were hanged in 1887 for complicity in the Haymarket Square bombings the year before. Socialist protests against these executions had led the American public to believe that socialists and anarchists were identical, and in some instances they were, as persistent anarchist infiltration of the First International and the Socialist Labour Party demonstrated. To the average American of the 80s, as Edward Bellamy said, the very word socialism brought to mind ideas of atheism, revolution, and sexual novelties. Visits to the United States in 1884 by Frederick Engels and in 1886 by Wilhelm Liebknecht, a co-founder of Germany's Social Democratic Party, did nothing to dispel that impression. Engels' godless views on religion and marriage, as expressed in his Origin of the Family, were widely publicized. Wilhelm Liebknecht, who prophesied the future triumph of socialism in the United States one Sunday afternoon at Brommer's Park in New York City, was accompanied by Eleanor Marx and her common-law husband, Edward Aveling, translator of Das Kapital into English. During a 15-week lecture tour as guests of the Socialist Labour Party, the couple's unconventional union provoked a public scandal. Here, it seemed, was living proof that socialists favoured free love and flouted family ties, and the topic was revived at intervals long after the unhappy Eleanor Marx in England had committed suicide as a result of Aveling's desertion. Abhorred by Native American working men and members of the urban middle class, socialist ideas nevertheless began in the middle 80s to exert a certain fascination in learned circles. They were spread by professors and students of a new, somewhat occult science known as political economy. Foremost among those campus soothsayers was Professor Richard T. Ely of Johns Hopkins University, later of the University of Wisconsin, where notably he influenced the thought of a future governor of Wisconsin and progressive senator, Robert M. La Follette. It was Professor Ely who took the initiative in organizing the American Economic Association, which convened for the first time on September the 9th, 1885, at the fashionable United States Hotel in Saratoga, New York. Minutes of this historic meeting show that the socialist-minded element at one captured a majority of the association's elective offices. Professor Ely, who served as chairman, was voted general secretary of the organization. Two like-minded colleagues, Professors H.C. Adams of Cornell and E.J. James of Pennsylvania, were elected first and second vice presidents, and Professor E.W. Bemis, later on the faculty of the University of Chicago, attended as secretary of the Connecticut branch. Included among the several hundred charter members, not yet a recognized authority, was the future Professor John R. Commons of Indiana and Michigan universities, whose outline of political economy became a standard textbook for several generations of college students throughout the country. So interesting here that it's professors and then who are introducing this way of thinking. It's coming from the professors are writing the books, and then they're teaching the students who are then getting indoctrinated into the same ideas. Not much has changed, eh? Those five were the main leaders of academic socialism, which in their day cast a shadow no larger than a man's head. They argued privately and sometimes publicly for the municipal or national ownership of what they termed natural monopolies. So there's that monopolies thing, getting rid of competition, getting rid of free market trade, and having a top-down control over everything in the hands of a very small group. That is like the plan. That's what they're trying to get. That is what they are looking for. Oh, I've just noticed we've got CS Malley in the chat on Rumble. Hello. And we've also got ESP and Hermit Tramp on Odyssey. So hello to you too. We've got people spread out across the platforms tonight, which is lovely. Okay, so I'll go back to the start of that sentence. They argued privately and sometimes publicly for the municipal or national ownership of what they termed natural monopolies, but for the time being did not profess to the full socialist program of nationalizing all land and capital. The New Learned Society provided a dignified sounding board for their doctrines, as it does for their modern counterparts. It is interesting to note that the American Economic Association very soon published over its imprint 2 essays by an amateur economist who also happened to be the chairman of the London Fabian Society, the emerging Sidney Webb. Lending the authority of the cloth to the association's original meeting were the Reverend Lyman Abbott and the Reverend Washington Gladden, both to become prominent in the Christian socialist movement. There was also Dr. E.R.A. Seligman of Columbia, the association's first treasurer, who became something of a power behind the scenes in national politics as well as in the academic world. Member of a wealthy German-American banking family in New York and privately tutored as a lad by Horatio Alger of the Rags to Riches precepts, Dr. Seligman was usually regarded as a conservative. Yet, throughout a long lifetime, he condoned every heterodoxy in the name of academic freedom. The Reverend Abbott, a future editor of the Outlook, and Dr. Seligman were promptly named to the Council of the American Economic Association together with a reserved lantern-jawed young associate professor from Bryn Mawr College, Dr. Woodrow Wilson, who none suspected would one day be President of the United States. And I think, hang on a sec, on the topic of that, speaking about synchronicities, although it wasn't here that I was speaking about synchronicities, was it? That was in a group call that I was in before this. But synchronicities, they happen all the time, especially when you are on the right path in life and when you are being sort of pulled along. The universe winks at you and hints that you're on the right path in many different ways. You got to keep an eye out for these. But the mention of Woodrow Wilson just reminded me that I got this in the post. today, I think, which is the book To End All Wars, Woodrow Wilson and the Quest for a New World Order by Thomas J. Nock. This is an ex-library book withdrawn from LSE Library, London School of Economics Library. Or maybe not. Maybe it's London. Yeah, no, it's LSE. This is an ex-London School of Economics book. So talk about synchronicities. So for those who don't know, Sydney and Beatrice Webb founded the London School of Economics. And now I have the London School of Economics library book here in my collection about Woodrow Wilson, whom was just mentioned in the book we are reading on the stream tonight. So there you are. There is a live example of a completely unplanned synchronicity in action. How about that? I swear that wasn't planned. I love it when stuff like that happens. Immune to PR says hello. Good evening and welcome. Thank you for your comments on the video. It's always nice when people interact and leave a comment. Helps things become more visible. So shout out to you. Hope you're doing well and glad you can make it. All right, we'll go back to the book. We'll just adjust that. It's a bit bright. Appointed to the Labour Committee was Woodrow Wilson's good friend Dr. Albert Shaw, then editor of the Tribune in Minneapolis with its strongly German socialist population, and later chosen to edit the influential Review of Reviews. Dr. Shaw's personal contacts with British Fabians were established in the 90s when he published a book entitled Municipal Government in Great Britain. Other characters of incidental interest attending the founders' meeting of the American Economic Association were Thomas Davidson, who had inadvertently helped to found the Fabian Society of London, and F.H. Giddings, editor of the Springfield Union, where Edward Bellamy was employed for 5 years. It must be recorded that representation of the New England colleges was slight, and not a single professor from Harvard was elected to office that year, an omission long since rectified. In those post-Civil War years, education was moving westward along with the expanding economy. At its annual meeting 3 years later, members of the same association listened to a paper by a solemn, bearded little Englishman wearing a beribboned pince-nez. It was Sidney Webb in person, appearing as an emissary of the British Economic Association, which was afterwards renamed the Royal Economic Society, which a fellow Fabian, George Bernard Shaw, had been instrumental in founding. Flanked by his faithful lieutenant, Edward R. Pease, Webb came to America for the first time in September 1888 and remained for a full 3 months. In his portmanteau, he carried the manuscript of an essay, The Historical Aspects of the Basis of Socialism, shortly to be published as Socialism in England. Sorry, just had to clear my throat there. Shortly to be published as Socialism in England over the imprint of the American Economic Association, and later included in the Fabian Essays, for whose American edition of 1894 Edward Bellamy wrote a foreword. In America of the late 1880s, the cocksure young Londoner found a strange new world, pulsating and throbbing with gigantic economic forces that were producing fresh forms of wealth undreamed of by even the most utopian imagination. But his conceit was equal to the challenge. He had no scruples in recommending the same gradualist tactics of revolution which he felt were destined to conquer England for socialism. To Webb's calculating eye, it was plain that any frontal attack against the vast new citadel of capitalism was doomed to failure. In fact, owing to the furor already created by a handful of anarchists and militant socialists, the little socialist movement in the United States faced the possibility of being outlawed by act of Congress unless it could speedily muster the support of a large body of respectable middle-class opinion around the country. For that purpose, Edward Bellamy's well-contrived novel, which its author acknowledged was written, quote, to convert the cultured and conservative classes, provided a practical springboard. New England, with its close cultural ties to Old England and its susceptibility to new thought of all kinds, seemed the logical place from which to launch a new and less vulnerable type of socialist movement. Sentimental memories still lingered there of Brook Farm and other utopian communities, and the influence of the English Christian socialists had lately made itself felt through the writings of Dr. Elisha Mulford and the Reverend Washington Gladden. Theosophy, which stressed the brotherhood of a fatherless humanity, was also winning converts. Bostonians had heard of the beautiful Annie Besant, a leading British theosophist who was likewise a member of the London Fabian Society. And remember that theosophy is the religion of the UN. When Sidney Webb and Edward Pease appeared in Boston during the autumn of 1888, armed with letters of introduction to literary folk, college professors, clergymen, and assorted uplifters, no more than 10,000 copies of Looking Backward had been sold. Enough to make it a bestseller at the time, but only a glimmering of what was to come. While literary promotion was not the Fabians' prime purpose, from first to last they have never objected to making the fortune of an author or a publisher, provided they could, in the process, create a cordial climate of opinion for socialism. Chief beneficiary in this instance was the Houghton Mifflin Company, which purchased the rights from Lee and Shepard and, as a result of certain activities set in motion by the two English visitors, was able to develop Bellamy's book into a uniquely valuable property. The previous June, a pair of Boston newspapermen had already written to Bellamy expressing their desire to form a club for the propagation of his ideas. They were Cyrus Field Willard, labor reporter from the Boston Globe and a relative of Francis E. Willard, and Sylvester Baxter, editorial writer for the Boston Herald, who had penned the first ecstatic review of Looking Backward. Both were theosophists, devotees of Madame Blavatsky and Annie Besant. Since summer hardly seemed the best season for rounding up an organization of cultured Bostonians, Baxter seized the opportunity for making a trip to Germany with a stopover in London. Meanwhile, several former Army officers in Boston wrote to Bellamy on September the 7th, telling him of their own plan to found a club in his name. The leaders were Captain Charles E. Bowers and General Arthur F. Devereux, a Civil War hero who made a name for himself at Gettysburg. Whatever their intention, it was certainly not to advance the cause of socialism. In common with other thoughtful citizens, they viewed the sudden eruption of trusts and monopolies in the United States with concern. At the same time, they could not fail to be aware of the problems created by wave after wave of immigrant labor pouring into a country largely unprepared to receive them. So that the newcomers were often victimized both by earlier arrivals from their own native lands and by chaotic new conditions of industry. In establishing a club for the elevation of man, General Devereux and his friends hoped to suggest the need for specific reform measures to both major political parties in America before the problems at hand became too acute for an orderly solution. On September the 18th, their little group, named the Boston Bellamy Club, held an initial meeting with 27 charter members. At this point, it began to look as if more patriotic elements had stolen a march on the socialists. In haste, Edward Bellamy sent a letter from his retreat in Chicopee Falls, begging the military men to postpone further meetings and to unite with the group which Willard and Baxter still hoped to organize. The moment was a delicate one, calling for some diplomacy, and just then, as if by prearrangement, a master diplomat in embryo, Sidney Webb, appeared on the scene. Minutes of the British Fabian Society indicated that by September the 21st, Webb had already left London for the United States. In October, a conference was held, and the two factions agreed to combine. On December the 6th, a committee was named to draft a joint statement of policy quite unlike that previously adopted by the military group. Besides the two army officers and the two journalists, another voice was introduced on the committee. It was the voice of the Reverend W.D.P. Bliss, carefully prompted by Sidney Webb. Bliss was a local clergyman, soon to assume the duties of pastor at Grace Church in South Boston, and to be dismissed a few years afterwards for his socialist activities, Christian and otherwise. Born in Constantinople of American missionary parents, Bliss was a frequent visitor to London where he fell under the Fabian spell. For some 20 years, he proved himself an eager spokesman of Fabian socialism in the United States and an exponent of the superior virtues of the London Fabian Society. As a writer, editor, and organizer, he was almost abject in his adulation of Webb and Pease, who sometimes found themselves embarrassed by his misplaced zeal. Ousted from one church after another and unable to support himself by writing, he later secured a position with the United States Bureau of Labor, the first but by no means the last old socialist to withdraw to that snug harbour. The 12 weeks Webb and Pease spent in the United States during the autumn of 1888 coincided exactly with the period when the revised Boston Bellamy Club was in process of being formed. In certain respects, the club was similar to the London Fabian Society, with a declaration of principles corresponding to the Fabian basis, and subscribed to by members of the parent club and affiliates to be set up throughout the country. The name proposed for the new organisation was typical of the Webb talent for compromise. It was to be called the Nationalist Club, a name which appealed on one hand to patriotic pride and on the other hand suggested the club's final goal, namely the nationalisation of private industry. The purpose of the club was to educate the American people through lectures, books, and publications in the reform measures and general ideas advocated by looking backward, and therefore to stimulate such political action as might ultimately lead to the establishment of the cooperative commonwealth, a polite synonym for the all-embracing state foretold in other terms by Marx and Engels. The Declaration of Principles showed the imprint of Sidney Webb's hand down to the use of the words practical and practicability, which characterize so many impractical documents drafted by him over the years. The statement is worth quoting, at least in part, because of its devious nature and because of its subsequent acceptance by thousands of well-meaning, if ingenuous, Americans. Quote, "The principle of the brotherhood of humanity is one of the eternal truths that govern the world's progress on lines which distinguish human nature from brute nature. No truth can avail unless practically applied. Therefore, those who seek the welfare of man must endeavour to suppress the system founded on brute principles of competition and put in its place another based on the nobler principles of association. We advocate no sudden or ill-considered changes. We make no war upon individuals who have accumulated immense fortunes simply by carrying to a logical end the false principles upon which business is now based. The combinations, trusts, and syndicates of which the people at present complain demonstrate the practicability of our basic principle of association. We merely seek to push this principle a little further and have all industries operated in the interests of the nation, the people organized, the organic unity of the whole people." At a meeting on December the 15th, 1888, where Edward Bellamy made one of his rare personal appearances and was elected vice president of the club, this declaration was approved by the leaders. Private papers of the president, General Devereux, reveal that a member of the Fabian Society of London, presumed to be Sidney Webb himself, attended incognito. The same statement was read and adopted by the general membership at the first public meeting of the Boston Nationalist Club in Tremont Hall on January the 18th, 1889. By that date, Sidney Webb had returned to England, leaving behind a lively memento of his visit. Historically, it was only the first in a long series of informally linked undertakings to be promoted under Fabian socialist tutelage in the United States. All have been marked by the same superficial candour and mildness and an air of bland self-righteousness which seems to be the peculiar contribution of New England to the American psyche. And yet, from the very beginning, all these organizations were penetrated at the core by a Fabian socialist conspiracy to capture the mind of America and eventually the machinery of government in the interests of a revolutionary future wholly alien to the American tradition. Ooh, chapter 9, done and dusted. I'm going to mute for a second while I scratch my nose. It got really itchy there towards the end of that one. And that's the dog in the other room. Little Abby. You might be able to hear dogs barking out the window over here, and then Abby barking on the other side of that door over there. So apologize if that is disturbing your ear holes at all. Oh, LJ says the screen is frozen. Hopefully you refreshed the browser and that fixed it maybe. It hasn't frozen on my side. I'm still moving and waving my arms about. And I'm working on Rumble, on Odyssey, and on Entropy. I always forget to mention Entropy. And on YouTube. So, yeah, I think it's on your end, that issue. Frank Lennon says, kill competition and you kill innovation and progress. However, it's the aim of modern corporates to merge and consolidate. Yeah, it is. Exactly. And, you know, it reminds me of when I go over to Vietnam. Everybody has a little business or something that they're doing in their home. And you walk down any street and, you know, even if it's just a little old lady sitting in her living room, she'll be selling cigarettes or pencils or chewing gum or little sachets of shampoo or something. People are just hustling. And what you would want is just an equal opportunity where anyone is free to start up a business. But instead, what we have is, because we live in a situation where a corporation's only duty, the only thing it must do in the eyes of the law is produce money for its shareholders and produce money for its investors. And when you start to realize that everything is a corporation, nations are corporations, police forces are corporations, local councils and governments are corporations, you realize why things are set up the way they are. And the only way to keep making profit all the time is to absorb more people, is to exploit more people, and to grow and grow and grow and grow and grow. It's very tricky to just have a business, build, you know, take it to a certain size and then just coast along at that size. You know, but they want to get rid of the small and the medium sized things, and they just want to have this like top down total monopoly on everything. But as we learned from Wikipedia, when the Soviet system was rolled out, and it was in Russia, in the USSR, and it was the first centrally planned national economy, it just led to the deaths of millions and millions of people through starvation. And the only way they fixed that was to give private ownership back to small and medium sized businesses. So it's just a non-starter, and they know it's a non-starter. But so it's very hard to get into the mindset of the people who are, you know, the Webbs and the George Bernard Shaws. I'm finding it very tricky to get into their mindset. When I was giving my summary earlier of part one, I realized I don't think I did a very good job of explaining their motivation. Why are they doing this? Why are they interested in it? And I think part of that is because I find it very hard to understand myself. Why anybody would push for this lowering of living standards for the masses and the majority, and the raising and the consolidation of wealth and power in the hands of a very small group. Like, unless the only way you would want to do that is if you're in that group, if you are in that if you're in that small sort of cabal, sort of club, 1% of the 1% who has wealth that has been passed down generationally. And we know that a lot of these people did have that because they didn't work. I've got a really itchy nose. Sorry about that. I shouldn't be touching my nose so much on live on stream. So perhaps their motivation is just simply motivated by protecting themselves and ensuring that maybe they truly believe that they are better and wiser and more precious and special than the rest of us, and therefore they have to do whatever is necessary, and they roll out this scam of socialism / communism, and they tell us, oh, it's because we care about you, and we were interested in the benefit of the public good and the community and the nation as a whole, and this collectivist sort of, because collectivism is just the good intentions that pave the road to hell. You know, the amount of death and destruction and murder and rape and pillage and senseless death and suffering that's happened in the name of, you know, the greater good, the collectivism, it's for the benefit of the society and the group and the community. It is crazy to even think of, and to try and put a number on it, just astounding. And I mentioned in a previous video that communism has a much, much higher death toll than than capitalism, or, you know, the other isms, proven. And yet you can still walk around, and if you're a blue-haired university student who's confused about their pronouns, you can call yourself a communist, and you can put it on your Twitter and your profiles on social media, and it's fine and celebrated and cool. And you have academics openly call themselves Marxists and communists. You have politicians, in America at least, who openly call themselves Marxists and communists. Yet this ideology is proven to lead to mass starvation and the deliberate, call it what it is, murder of just untold numbers of people. It's just mind-boggling to me. So trying to get into the mindset of these people and why they're doing it, I think the only thing that sort of explains it is that they consider that they will be the ones who are overseeing and running the system. They're bureaucrats. They don't want to do anything productive or valuable. They don't want to provide a service to improve and lift up the lives of their fellow human beings. They just want to attend meetings and write some things down on the minutes, write a policy, make some decisions, and then, you know, live the high life without actually producing anything, without providing anything, without improving the lives of anyone around them. They've got that mentality of like, well, we're the managers, you know, we're the people who keep the rest of you in line. We're the shepherds who take care of the herd of sheep who are too dumb and stupid, and they need us there to guide them and tell them what to do and what to think, and to manipulate their worldview and to keep them docile and passive, right? It's like they set themselves apart as this sort of managerial, bureaucratic class that's sort of above and sits on top of the rest of us and gets to just cream off the hard work and the labor of everyone else. Yeah. So that's kind of where I'm at. If you got any thoughts on that, please let me know. Gwen is saying they probably really believed that what they were doing was right, but they were fanatics. Were they motivated by a deep-seated guilt? So I'm not even sure if they did believe that what they were doing was right, but I could be being more cynical than is needed. So I don't know. I'll try and wait for the pooch to calm down a bit before we crack on with the next chapter. She usually calms down if I give her a little scratch around the neck, but obviously she's not in the room, so I can't do that. Now they're having a conversation. There's dogs barking out the window, and she's barking on that side. I need to play some lift music. I could put my waiting screen back on and give you a little waiting room music while these dogs settle it. We'll check the chats in Rumble and Odyssey. We have got Hermit Tramp, a UK trucker, listening in. I hope you are driving safely and your journey's going well. I bet you've had some good views and vistas during the sunshine and the beautiful sort of heading into summer evenings that we're having at the moment. We've got ESP as well, saying sugar, that should detooth a few. Yeah, definitely. Sugar is just... It's just one of those things. White powders in general aren't too good for you, are they? Anything that's like processed and distilled down into a white powder tends not to be too good for you. All right, what's going on in Rumble? CS Mally 369. Are you still there? I don't know why I'm typing it as I'm saying it. I think it's the first time I've seen you on the stream though, so if you are still there, very good to have you here. Thanks for checking in and sending a message. And I don't think we have anybody on Entropy. We got 2 people watching, but no comments. All right, let's carry on. So the thing that stood out to me from that last chapter is how they are writing books. This is a fantastic way to spread worldviews, to manipulate people's opinions, and to propagate propaganda. Is to write it in books and novels and sell them, you know, and hype them up in magazines and news reviews. And so these dogs are going crazy. you have your man, whether it's your H.G. Wells or it's your Ian Fleming or whoever it is that's doing the bit of work for you. You have them write the propaganda in the form of the story, which portrays a certain image or a certain idea, and then you hype it up and you big it up, and you have them. Back in the day, they probably didn't do this, but nowadays you would have them on all the talk shows, and then you would have a guest interview with them, and you would have reviews in every newspaper and every magazine, and you would just push it and push it and push it using the apparatus of the mainstream media. And people think, oh, everyone's talking about it, it must be really good. Classic example, 50 Shades of Grey. That series of novels, I never read it, but I heard Alan Watt talking about it, and he blew my mind because he was pointing out that when psychologists have analyzed the book, what they've found is the main character, the female character who engages in this kind of dominant, submissive relationship with a I think an older guy. In the book, she's maybe 21 or something, and he's 30. I don't know how old he is, but he's older. But when you actually read the language she uses, it's the language of a much, much, much younger person, a girl. It's like the language of a preteen girl, 12, 13 kind of age, the language used. And so the book is actually a vehicle for this intergenerational whatever you want to call it. There's words I probably shouldn't say, but that relationship that spans generations, right? Even though it tells you, oh, I'm a 21-year-old something or other and I work in an office or whatever, the actual language used is that of a preteen, very much, much, much younger. And that kind of puts a whole even more disgusting spin on it, right? Yet, when it came out, everyone was talking about it. All these, it's so controversial and it's so sexy and it's a guilty pleasure. And it was on news, morning talk shows as this thing that, was people shouldn't read, and it was really controversial. But it's all staged. It's all planned. It's all to get you exposed to their agenda, so that when it actually happens, you'll be a lot more comfortable with it, and you won't fight back and push back and call it out in the same way with the same sort of passion and anger and frustration and disbelief that you should have. You've kind of been psychologically prepared for it, so that when it happens, you're kind of like, meh, whatever, So they're doing the same thing that still happens today. It's write a novel, push it, spin up some hype around it. People get interested in it. Everybody wants to read it. And then, sooner or later, people are paying you. You're making money from people paying you to read the propaganda that you've designed for them, like it's the same thing now with going to the cinema. All Hollywood films are just propaganda of some sort, pretty much. Yet you pay to go and see that, right? So you're paying to watch the enemy's propaganda. And it's the same with branded clothing or accessories, right? You're paying to advertise for this company, that to plaster their logos all over your body. Now, if you're a Formula One driver, you get paid to plaster your body all over in these corporate logos. But the average Joe and Jane on the street, I'm paying you so that I can be a walking billboard for your company. Like, how does that work? It doesn't make any sense. It's just it's backwards, right? Similar kind of thing. So, you got to be very aware of these things and what you're actually paying for and handing money over for. Why would you pay to be propagandized? Same thing with like Netflix and these subscription services. You're paying them in order to access the propaganda, which is designed to work against you. It's just wild. It's just such a crazy time where we live in. But it's been going on for a long time, is my point, why I went on that little ramble there. CESP says that my dog is psychic. No, Immune to PR's dog started barking, which means your dogs are psychic. Immune to PR, I think that's what he's saying. So, all the dogs are barking. They're all cheering me on. It's very nice of them that they waited to do that while we were between chapters, though. So, And I think they've calmed down now, so I think it's a good moment to carry on with another chapter. So a lot of permeation, a lot of penetration of unions, labor unions, of political parties, of universities, of and then also using these religious figures as well that it touched on there in that last chapter. There's a lot of names there I've never heard of before, but of very striking interest to me is these connections with Theosophy, Annie Besant, and Madame Blavatsky. Those connections I would love to learn more about, knowing what we know about the UN with its little meditation room, with its black square / column, you know, like the what do they call it? It's in that film, the Kubrick film. There's like that black column that appears every time there's a leap forward or an advancement in the civilization. Somebody must know what I'm talking about. Column's not the right word though. It's something else. But anyway, there's one of those in the meditation room in the UN. So there's a very close link between the UN and Theosophy, Madame Blavatsky, Annie Besant, the Lucifer publishing company, which became the Lucius publishing company, and I think is probably also a trust as well. I'm not sure about that. That's it. Thank you, Frank. It's monolith. Yeah, monolithic. So it's a black monolith that is in the Kubrick film Space Odyssey. And no, that's a Bowie song. I'm getting all my references messed up now. We'll just go back to the book. No, it was 2001 Space Odyssey. I got that right. The Bowie song is Space Oddity. There you are. Self-correction. So yeah, just to wrap that up, that point, the connection between Theosophy, Annie Besant, Madame Blavatsky, and Fabian socialism, that would be very much worth diving into and exploring more, in my humble opinion. Okay, let's move over there a bit. And we'll just have a sip and wait for my dog to calm down. Okay, she's not going to calm down, so we're just going to crack on. 10. Putting the silk hat on socialism. 1. For a few years, the Bellamy cult spread like a brush fire across the United States. By November 1890, its leaders reported 158 nationalist clubs in 27 states. Also, just as a side point, the interesting this conflation of national to nationalize something and to be a nationalist and have patriotic pride in your country and the land from whence you came. It's very clever of them. And again, another example that is kind of parallel or at least captured by the wolf in sheep's clothing image, that they're saying nationalism and people are like, yay, nationalism. And they're like, not that nationalism, this nationalism. And they're using nationalism as a means by which to get people to sign on to something which is actually going to lead to the erosion of nationalism and the consolidation of internationalism and a sort of one world system, one world government, which is kind of what we're facing in the times that we're living through. Immune to PR says black cubes. Yeah, that's a reference to. So you've got the black cube at Mecca. You've got the black monolith cube thing in the meditation room in the UN. You've got the small hat people with the black cube hats. Black cubes all over the place. I think there's a whole mythology around that, connecting it to Saturn. But I'm not going to go into that here. There's plenty of other people who do that much better than I ever possibly could. So carrying on with the 158 nationalist clubs in 27 states. 16 of these clubs were located in New York and 65 in California, which Lawrence Gronlund exuberantly judged to be more nearly ripe for the cooperative commonwealth than any other state in the Union. The movement bypassed former Confederate states and made few overtures to the Catholic Church, generally viewed in the 19th century as an immigrant church, notwithstanding the fact that Catholic colonists in Maryland and Pennsylvania had fought almost to a man in the War of Independence. According to Edward Bellamy, his new social gospel was to be spread not by foreign malcontents, but by Americans descended from generations of Americans. In February 1891, 165 chartered clubs existed throughout the country, a majority of them in the far and middle west. Fully 50 newspapers supported the nationalist cause in whole or in part, and Sylvester Baxter declared you could not go into a major newspaper office in New York, Philadelphia, or Boston without finding one or more nationalists on the staff. Though the Atlantic remained aloof, other respected monthly magazines of the age opened their pages to nationalist propaganda. Bellamy himself contributed a brief article to the North American Review on the, quote, progress of nationalism in the United States. The first issue of a brand new periodical called The Literary Digest, launched in March 1890, featured a lead article by General Francis A. Walker, president of Massachusetts Institute of Technology and original president of the American Economic Association. It was a critique, mildly critical, but nonetheless friendly, of that much-reviewed novel Looking Backward. Early numbers of the Literary Digest were loaded with references to nationalism in America and socialism in Great Britain, though no connection between the two was inferred. There were items on nationalist clubs in California and elsewhere, as well as an article by one Angelo Majorama on, quote, socialism in England, reporting that socialism has invaded the universities and, in England, is closely allied with religion. And the re-election of Annie Besant to the London School Board was politely noted. There she is, Annie Besant, theosophist. Repeatedly, the middle-class character of the nationalist clubs was stressed, especially in their own club notes, printed in a short-lived official monthly, The Nationalist. Started in Boston with 50 members, the clubs attracted some rather well-known personalities of the day, and the movement as a whole was stamped with the hallmark of New England culture. The membership of the Boston Club was a good deal more impressive, if less cohesive, than the London Fabian Societies had been at the time of its founding only 5 years earlier. There was William Dean Howells, venerable and kindly Dean of American Letters, the Reverend Edward Everett Hale, product of the Harvard Divinity School and scion of Mayflower Pilgrims, widely known as the author of that patriotic classic, The Man Without a Country. Hamlin Garland, writer of homespun tales from the Midwestern prairies, and John Storr Cobb, a founder of the Theosophical Society in America. While subscribing to the club's socialist program, most of these respectable gentlemen were apparently unaware of the Marxist philosophy that prompted it. Each, in his own fashion, was a prototype of the non-analytical do-gooder who has contributed liberally ever since to the spread of what Eleanor Marx called unconscious socialism in America. Like the Fabian Society of London, the nationalist clubs welcomed members of both sexes, a somewhat daring innovation in a 19th century politico-cultural movement. Active women who joined the Boston Club included Julia Ward Howe, author of, quote, The Battle Hymn of the Republic, Frances E. Willard, reformer and temperance leader, Anne Whitney, the sculptress who made a bust of James A. Walker, president of Harvard University, Mary A. Livermore, editor and suffragette, and Lucy Stone, the feminist whose followers embarrassed 3 decades of hotel clerks by their insistence that married ladies should use their maiden names. So again, the same thing that they did in Britain, they're appealing to the women and using the promise of equality and making things more equal between the sexes as a way to garner and gather the power and support of half the population. In Fort Dodge, Iowa, and Fall River, Massachusetts, it was said the best people in town attended nationalist meetings. In San Francisco, a popular rabbi resigned from his synagogue to preach the tidings of nationalism to Jew and Gentile alike. The Chicago Club, which assembled by written invitation on May the 6th, 1889, in the gilt and plush elegance of the recently opened Palmer House, was composed of merchants, bank officers, lawyers, and other presumably solid citizens. Nationalist groups, like their cousins of the British Fabian Society, always claimed to have the working man's welfare at heart, but apparently desired few personal contacts with him. That's a great bit. Again, it's the way they operate. We want the best for everyone. We're looking out for the downtrodden, for the hardworking man. We care about making things better for you. Oh, but stay over there and we don't want to mix with you or associate with you, and don't come into our clubs and our meetings or anything. Oh no, we're just going to write our books and our pamphlets and get them into universities and the hands of professors, and stand up here on the stage and preach to you and talk to you, but you go back to your homes, your dirty little homes over there, you peasants, and we'll go back to our big houses and estates over here. And that's the natural order of things. A handful of confirmed socialists steered the organizational work and controlled policy statements. Besides Bellamy himself, they included Lawrence Gronlund, the bridge from an earlier Marxism, Eltweed Pomeroy, owner of an industrial plant in New Jersey, who sponsored one of the country's first employee profit-sharing schemes, and the Reverend W.D.P. Bliss, Fabian apostle to the clergy, who spent much of his time trying to convince various Protestant churchmen and their flocks that Christianity and socialism were compatible in practice, contrary to what they might chance to read in papal encyclicals. And there's a footnote here on encyclicals, which I'm going to read because I've never heard of that word encyclical before. In 3 encyclicals, Pope Leo XIII traced the social rules to be followed by Christian Democrats. 1. In Quod Apostolici Muneris, December 28, 1878, he indicated that, quote, the equality existing among the various members of society consists only in this, that all men have their origin in God the Creator, have been redeemed by Jesus Christ, and are to be judged and rewarded or punished by God exactly according to their merits or demerits. 2. In Rerum Novarum, May 15, 1891, he affirmed that, quote, the right of private property, the fruit of labour or industry, or of concession or donation by others, is an incontrovertible natural right, and everybody can dispose reasonably of such property as he thinks fit. Yeah, so that's kind of going against what the Fabians want to convince people is true, right? On Manhattan Island, Percival Chubb, a charter member of the London Fabian Society who sailed to America in 1888 and lived there till his death at the age of 99, proselytized cheerfully among the ethical culturalists. In their delight at the movement's sudden growth, its organizers failed to follow the cautious example of the English Fabians, who refused to identify their society with the fortunes of any political splinter party. As a result, the nationalist clubs were quickly absorbed into the People's Party, which in the national elections of 1892 gleaned over 1 million votes and won 22 seats in the Electoral College. William Dean Howells claimed that Edward Bellamy virtually founded the Populist Party, and indeed its platform clearly reflected the ideas of looking backward. By the close of 1892, most of the nationalist clubs had disappeared. By that time, also, Bellamy's much vaunted Americanism had begun to ring a bit hollow, thanks to an editorial of his which appeared in the Boston Globe for July 4th, 1892. There he proclaimed that, quote, in the year 1992, the 4th of July will have ceased to be a popular holiday of much note. I can imagine that went down well with the Americans. He predicted, quote, another declaration of independence in America, which in importance will quite eclipse the document, great in its way as that was, promulgated in Philadelphia 116 years ago. It would, he said, abolish distinctions between employer and employed, capitalist and proletarian, and put an end to economic inequality. Without specifying the precise day, month, or year when this newer and greater Declaration of Independence would come, he announced, quote, I believe it will come, and that society will be, peaceably or forcibly, conformed to its terms within the expectations of men now middle-aged. Those explosive remarks were made in an era when the glorious Fourth was celebrated with picnics, parades, and firecrackers everywhere in the United States, and when the day itself was regarded by adults and children alike as being only second in importance to Christmas. While Bellamy's editorial was greeted with cheers by all convinced socialists, including a close-knit group of upper-class men and recent alumni of Harvard University who had succumbed to the nationalist lure, it offended public opinion in Boston and the country as a whole. His prediction that society would be peaceably or forcibly transformed within a relatively few years rather deflated the claims made by Bellamy admirers then and since to the effect that he was, quote, one of the most peaceful and humane revolutionists who ever lived. Partly because of this incident, partly because the novelty of the whole thing had worn thin, the nationalist movement was soon extinct, despite efforts of Bellamy and his friends to revive it. Nevertheless, it accomplished the one practical purpose for which it had been so hastily launched. When the Congress of the United States, impelled by the violence-scarred Homestead and Pullman strikes, passed a law in 1894 declaring anarchism illegal, socialism escaped the prohibition. Having caught the fancy, however fleeting, of many middle-class folk in urban communities throughout the United States, socialism had acquired some veneer of respectability. As Edward Bellamy noted in his introduction to the 1894 American edition of Fabian Essays, nationalism was, chiefly, the form in which, quote, scientific socialism had thus far brought to the attention of the American people. Had thus far been brought to the attention of the American people. Older, more literal Marxists were impressed in spite of themselves and agreed with something like relief that Bellamy had succeeded in putting the silk hat on socialism in America. To a number of younger men and women, nationalism also provided the starting point for future careers in other socialist-dominated enterprises to come. Along with the aging Colonel Thomas Wentworth Higginson, such youthful sprigs as Mary Livermore and Mary Austin of the Boston Nationalist Club in time became pillars of the Intercollegiate Socialist Society, afterwards the League for Industrial Democracy. So did Florence Kelley of the New York Club, who had studied Marxism in Switzerland. She became a self-anointed crusader against child labour, and as chairman of the National Consumers League lobbied incessantly throughout the country for state and federal control of wages and working conditions. William J. Gent, a fellow member of New York's Nationalist Club, and Algernon Lee of the Milwaukee Club, became successive directors of the controversial Rand School of Social Science. From the Chicago Club came Clarence Darrow, dramatic defender of the McNamara brothers and other accused dynamiters, and a charter member of the ISS, and Henry Demarest Lloyd, author of Wealth Against Commonwealth, and an inspirer of the Public Ownership League of Chicago, which eventually fathered the Tennessee Valley Authority. Lloyd's son, David Demarest Lloyd, followed in his papa's footsteps, becoming Director of Research and Legislation in the Fabian-instigated Americans for Democratic Action, and serving just prior to his death in 1951 as a White House speechwriter for Fair Deal President Harry S. Truman. By that time, the Fabian technique of penetration had developed into a fine art in America. 2. For the time being, however, a good many budding radicals of Anglo-American stock and middle-class education found that with the collapse of the nationalist movement, they had no place to go. When the need for a helping hand became evident, William A. Clark of the London Chronicle and a member of London's Fabian executive was dispatched to assist those drifting American intellectuals who still dreamed of achieving a gradual and bloodless revolution in their native land. For the March 1894 issue of the New England Magazine, highly rated in academic and literary circles, Clark wrote an article simply entitled The Fabian Society. An able journalist and propagandist, William Clark was well qualified to pen an official apology for the British Fabian Society in the United States. Almost casually, He brushed aside the view, quote, still expressed sometimes in American newspapers that the socialist movement is largely made up of cranks and scoundrels. On the contrary, he said, quote, in Marx, Lassalle, Rodbertus, and others, the socialist movement has been served by some of the best brains of our century. I know the inside of the socialist movement well, and it certainly numbers among its adherents the ablest men I know. The Fabian Society contains not a few of these men. At present, almost all callings are represented in the Fabian Society of London and its 48 provincial societies. Lawyers, artists, journalists, doctors, working men, clergymen, teachers, trade union leaders, literary people, shopkeepers, and persons of no occupation. No millionaires. But quite a few well-to-do people. A large proportion are bright young men, and there are not a few bright and active women. This seems to have been the first public image of the London Fabian Society to be formally unveiled in America by one of its own leading spokesmen. The society was falsely depicted as being no more than a mild-mannered reform movement, quote, not looking for the millennium or any perfectly blissful earthly paradise. Its ultimate revolutionary aims, as expressed in the basis, were not stated. What the article sought chiefly to convey was an impression that most Fabian socialists were, quote, educated, intelligent, of sweet disposition, people who enjoy books and music and the theatre and good society. The socialist movement has taught them that there is a great suffering world beyond the four walls of home to be helped and worked for. Clark's artful press agentry was not only a timely prelude to the American edition of Fabian Essays, which appeared the same year, but served in a general way to whitewash the Fabians and their friends at home and abroad. Somehow, he contrived to suggest that the still youthful London Fabian Society was a solid, long-established British institution, one that could serve, although he tactfully refrained from saying so, as a model for socialist intellectuals aspiring to develop a similar leadership group in America. Just as soon as it became evident that socialist activities in the United States were not going to be declared illegal, William Clark offered his personal services in helping to found an American Fabian Society in Boston, with branches in other cities. Early in 1895, the irrepressible W.D.P. Bliss, stimulated by a recent visit to London, where he had mingled happily with the Fabian masterminds and arranged for the publication by Sonnenschein of his own Handbook of Socialism, assumed the editorship of a new monthly journal, the American Fabian. Published by the Fabian Educational Company of Boston, it was to become the organ of a projected American Fabian League as soon as such a body could be formed. Subscriptions were solicited from erstwhile nationalists and other socialist sympathizers on or off the university campuses at the modest price of 50 cents a year, 80 cents if ordered jointly with The Dawn, a Christian socialist sheet started by Bliss in 1889. Headquarters of the Fabian Educational Company were located at 241 Tremont Street by arrangement with the People's Party Club of Boston. A 20-page monthly, more pretentious in format than the slim but durable little Fabian News of London, the American Fabian first saw the light of day in February 1895. Disarmingly, the front page of its inaugural issue carried a photograph and profile of the British utopian philosopher William Morris, who believed in embellishing social reform with art, poetry, and other cultural adornments. The masthead featured a quotation from Mazzini, the Italian anarchist. Quote, "The next great word is association," a seemingly innocent word which the nationalists had employed in their platform as a synonym for nationalization. On an inner page, a new long-term revolutionary objective of the journal's founders was succinctly stated. It was not merely to rewrite the Declaration of Independence, as Bellamy had once suggested, but to effect a series of basic changes in the Constitution itself that would make possible the introduction of state socialism step by step in the United States. With all the valor of inexperience, the editors announced, more boldly than most of their modern counterparts, modern counterparts would care to do today. Quote, "We call our paper the American Fabian for two reasons. We call it Fabian because we desire to make it stand for the kind of educational socialist work which is so ably done by the English Fabian Society. We call our paper the American Fabian because our politics must in a measure differ from those of the English Fabians. England and America are alike in some things. In some things they are utterly unalike. England's unwritten constitution readily admits of constant, though gradual, modification. Our American Constitution does not readily admit of such change. England can thus move into socialism almost imperceptibly. Our Constitution, being largely individualistic, must be changed to admit of socialism, and each change necessitates a political crisis. This means the raising of great new issues." Wow, that's a hell of a quote. So they got to bring about the problem. It's basically admitting to problem, reaction, solution. Such far-reaching calculations were not wholly the fruit of American thinking, as can be deduced from the fact that the very next issue of the American Fabian printed the text of the London Fabian Society's basis. The, quote, "need to alter the Constitution of the United States as a preliminary to radical social change was reaffirmed just 3 years later by the British Fabian socialist Ramsay MacDonald. Returned from a trip to America, he gave a talk on the United States at the London Fabian Society's headquarters in Clement's Inn. Quote, "The great bar to socialist progress in the United States," said he, "is the written constitutions, federal and state, which give ultimate power to a law court." End quote. This assertion by a future socialist Prime Minister of England was made on January the 14th, 1898. And there is no reason to presume he or his Fabian associates in Britain and America ever deviated from that view. To subvert the underlying principles of the United States constitutions, federal and state, which upheld the right to own and operate private property as a corollary of the natural law, was a project of real magnitude. When proposed in the American Fabian, most Americans deemed such a thing to be impossible, just as it seemed impossible that a handful of gentle Fabian intellectuals in England could seriously shake the foundations of the British Empire. Confession of intent to revise the Constitution in America of the 1890s appeared more visionary than alarming. If it was ever to be accomplished, it would have to be done obliquely, secretively, and gradually over a period of years by a socialist elite schooled to take advantage of every local and national crisis for their own covert ends. So that's never let a good crisis go to waste. The first step was to develop a leadership group and a receptive body of public opinion through the organized promotion of socialist thought and study. To that end, the April 1895 issue of The American Fabian offered a tentative constitution for an American Fabian League. It was to be a federation of clubs, with national executive and publication committees, but without other national officers. Any club working in any way to spread socialist ideas or to advance any socialist measures could join the American Fabian League by applying to the Secretary of the Executive Committee. The various local clubs or societies were free to organize in any manner they wished and choose their own special objectives, methods of work, and time of meetings. They could use any name they preferred and could exercise full autonomy over their own members, who might or might not be outright socialists. One thing, however, was essential. The American Fabian League Constitution specified that in any club, only those persons who communicate in writing to the Secretary of the Executive Committee their acceptance of the principle of ownership and conduct of industry by the community shall have a right to hold office in the National Executive Committee or to vote in the National League. The publications committee would draft a program of, quote, measures or subjects for the federated clubs to consider and study or agitate upon, month by month, in order to produce systematic, concerted action. I'll take the barking dog as a moment to have a sip. All right. Here was the blueprint for a semi-secret national organization whose sole visible link with its members was the American Fabian. It is noteworthy that the magazine during its 5-year existence printed few names except those of publicists already well known. Club officers and personnel of the executive committee were not identified, and no membership figures were announced. Articles were generally unsigned or signed with only an initial, except when reprinted from other periodicals. In fact, it was several years before the American Fabian ventured to print a list of its own contributing editors, all socialists and former nationalists. As of February 1898, they were Edward Bellamy, W.D.P. Bliss, Helen Campbell, Eltweed Pomeroy, Henry Damarest Lloyd, Prestonia Mann, Professor Frank Parsons, and Charlotte Perkins Stetson. The Christmas issue of 1895 displayed a nativity scene, captioned, quote, "The birth of the first socialist," on the same page with a brief biography of the profoundly anti-religious Karl Marx. It also contained the following modest organizational items, quote, "The Kensington Fabian Group meets every Tuesday evening. Mr. Bliss is giving his course of lectures, and the hall is filling up. The Philadelphia Group meets every Saturday at 1305 Arch Street. The New York Society, formerly the Alturian Society, meets every Wednesday evening at 10 East 33rd Street. It has weekly discussions and debates, and on January the 8th we'll have a supper." No attempt was made to conceal the fact that the American movement maintained close ties with the British Fabian Society. A note in the same issue stated, quote, "Mr. E.R. Pease, Secretary of the London Society, writes us that if secretaries of American Fabian societies will send him their names and addresses, he will send them the Fabian news and tracts as they appear. Let us accept this generous offer and bind the English and American movements together. We need not and should not copy the English movement, but surely we may learn from the older and parent movement." Besides establishing direct contacts between the London executive and key individuals in American Fabian groups throughout the country, the generous offer made by Pease had other uses. Both the Fabian news and the tracts issued by the British Society, which appeared to the general reader to have a purely informational and propagandist content, could be construed by the faithful as providing quiet but unmistakable directives from the fountainhead of Fabian socialism in London. A full set of selected Fabian tracts for Americans was advertised at 75 cents in the American Fabian, bolstered by an admiring quotation from the Review of Reviews, which said, quote, "The peculiarity of the Fabian tracts is that every fact and statement in them has been verified." The American Fabian League was not planned as a mass organization. Its avowed purpose was to unite all existing reform movements in America under the leadership of individual socialists, who in turn received their instructions from a single national executive committee. The original program included planks on sound currency, a national 8-hour law, women's suffrage, state employment, bureaus and aid for the unemployed, and control over the sale of alcoholic beverages. Most of these proposals, since enacted into law, were not, in essence, socialist. They simply made it easier for individual socialists to penetrate labour, women's and temperance groups, with a view to winning mass support for other, more far-reaching socialist objectives outlined by the League's executive committee. Americans today may be surprised to find that the same Fabian program advocated a severely graduated income tax and a heavy and graduated inheritance tax, as well as a tax on land values. It also called for proportional representation, which aimed to give left-wing splinter parties a voice in government, local and national. The initiative and referendum, which would permit legislation to be initiated outside of the legislatures, and, quote, any constitutional amendments that might be needed to legalize the Fabian Socialist Plan for America. I just completely lost my place. Oh yeah, here. A strictly non-partisan approach to socialism was recommended for the American Fabian League. This would leave individual Fabians free to join any political party, socialist or otherwise, and work inside it to promote socialist legislation. When W.D.P. Bliss, in his capacity as editor of the American Fabian, came out strongly for Bryan and Free Silver in 1896, he was rebuked by Edward R. Pease for committing the American Fabian movement to the platform of a political party. Prestonia Mann, a well-to-do blue-stocking who aspired to become the Madame Récamier of a socialist salon, inherited the editorship of the American Fabian from Bliss. She had heartily endorsed the stand taken by Pease. The British Fabian Society, she wrote in a letter of December the 30th, 1896, to Henry Demarest Lloyd, owes most of its strength to its steadfastness in standing by its determination not to be beguiled into becoming a political party. We must follow the example of British Fabians. In April 1898, the American Fabian, whose editorial offices had been transferred from Boston to New York, reported briefly, quote, Sidney and Beatrice Webb, the distinguished authors of A History of Trade Unionism and Industrial Democracy, arrived in New York last week. They will remain in the country for a few months, returning to London about Christmas by way of New Zealand and Australia. Sidney Olivier, of the original Fabian Big Four, travelled with them as far as Washington on business for the British Colonial Office, lending a spuriously official aura to their journey. The Webbs encountered none of the disagreeable publicity which had attended the tour of Wilhelm Liebknecht and Eleanor Marx a dozen years before, and which marked the visit of the Russian socialist Maxim Gorky several years later. For one thing, they were properly married and acceptable in good society. For another, they shunned the limelight. With the caution and worldly wisdom that always characterized their personal behavior, they spoke at no mass meetings, made no conspicuous public appearances or political pronouncements. They lectured only to small groups of serious thinkers or hand-picked audiences on university campuses, and mingled with leading lights of the American Economic Association, whose books were regularly advertised in the American Fabian. In New York City, they dined with Prestonia Mann, at whose summer place in the Adirondacks and townhouse in Manhattan upper-class socialists met and mingled. The Webbs established the pattern for future visits to the United States by British Fabians, in which social diversion and socialist purpose were discreetly combined. In Chicago, the Webbs stayed at Hull House as guests of the very ladylike spinster Jane Addams, whose beautifully modulated voice and great inscrutable dark eyes masked a defiant and firebrand spirit. Beatrice Webb recalled the event long afterwards in her diary, failing to mention, however, that thereafter almost every British Fabian who visited the United States included a stop at Hull House on his schedule. Founded in 1889 and modelled after Toynbee Hall in London, where so many members of the London Society made their first carefully limited contacts with slum dwellers, Hull House launched the social settlement phase of the socialist movement in America, which afterwards spread to other cities. Like the earlier gospel missions, it combined the occasional soup kitchen and the supervised playground with indoctrination in a new gospel of social reform. It preceded by some 50 years the enactment of legislation creating politically administered city, state, and federal welfare agencies, and, in addition to its many incidentally charitable aspects, it served as an early experimental laboratory for the Fabian-invented social sciences. By now, the golden legend of Hull House has been so assiduously cultivated in book and story by friends and former residents that any attempt to expose its persistent socialist connections would be viewed as a sacrilege. And yet, as a sympathetic historian records, the doors of Hull House were always open to social and economic reformers and political radicals. There, the Social Democratic Party was organized by Eugene V. Debs in 1898 to replace what American Fabians termed the barbarous Socialist Labour Party, headed by the Curacao-born and German-educated Marxist Daniel de Leon, subsequently professor of international law at Columbia University. Like future socialist splinter parties, the short-lived Social Democratic Party sought to win working-class votes under the guidance of socialist intellectuals, but in no sense represented the full spectrum of intellectual socialism's activities and aims in the United States. A sudden upsurge of patriotic feeling in America preceded the outbreak of the Spanish-American War. In that atmosphere of hostility to all types of European penetration of the Western Hemisphere, it was once again obvious to sophisticated observers that no movement in the United States could survive which acknowledged foreign inspiration and leadership. Lawrence Gronlund raised the question, saying he preferred to be known as a collectivist rather than a Fabian. So did the former Altruian Society of New York, which had objected to the name Fabian because, quote, it seemed English and, quote, because a successful socialist movement in this country should be distinctly American. Evidently, the Webbs reached a similar conclusion, and their tour of 1898 signaled the beginning of the end for the American Fabian, though not for the movement it had helped to form. In the fall of that year, John W. Martin, graduate of London University, former vestryman from Hackney and member of the Fabian Executive from 1894 to 1899, followed the Webbs to America. Nominally, he was to deliver a series of lectures arranged for his benefit by branches of the American Fabian League. Additionally, his mission was to liquidate the American Fabian and to serve as a personal link between the surviving executive committee of the American Fabian League and the Fabian Executive of London. With Prestonian Man, Martin edited the last issues of the journal under the joint pseudonym of John Preston. The final issue appeared in 1899, approximately a year after the death of Edward Bellamy. Following the example of his London confrère, like himself of lower middle-class origin, who improved their fortunes and social position by wedding women of property, John W. Martin duly married the energetic Prestonian Man. Settling in New York, he dabbled in local school board politics and enjoyed the status derived from authorship of an occasional unpopular book. After gaining some slight notoriety in World War I as a financial backer of the Liberator magazine, he became, in his later days, a consultant on international affairs at Rollins College. Martin and his wife appear to have remained lifelong Fabians, maintaining contacts with high-level Fabian socialists, Britain and American, both in New York and at their ultimate retreat in Winter Park, Florida. Though the official organ of American Fabianism folded in 1899, the movement itself lived on in many seemingly disconnected small reform clubs across the nation. A Bellamy Memorial meeting of June 7, 1898, presided over by William Dean Howells and described in The American Fabian, had been sponsored by a Fabian group calling itself the Social Reform Club. In September 1898, W.D.P. Bliss was reported to be organizing a Union Reform League on the Pacific Coast, with tracts being prepared by Professor Commons of Syracuse University, Professor Frank Parsons of Boston University, Professor E.W. Bemis of the University of Chicago, and Dr. Charles B. Spaher of The Outlook. Already, the name Fabian and even the name Socialist were being discarded as a matter of procedure, though as late as 1919, local groups calling themselves Fabian societies were revived in Boston and Chicago. The brief public appearance of an American Fabian League in the 1890s coincided with what has been called the London Society's first blooming. Just as some persons still aver that the Fabian Society of London, which not only dominates the British Labour Party today, but the Socialist International as well, died at the turn of the century. Oh, sorry, I totally messed up that sentence. Just as some persons still aver that the Fabian Society of London died at the turn of the century, so it is misleadingly claimed that Fabian socialism died long ago in America, at the time when the American Fabian League dropped out of sight. A conveniently premature death notice found its way into American encyclopedias, confirmed with tongue-in-cheek by such an authority on social affairs as the late Morris Hillquit, himself a leading member of more than one Fabian-affiliated organization. The long-range objectives of Fabian socialism in the United States were clearly and permanently defined in the American Fabian. Techniques for achieving them had still to be developed, along with the openings for putting those techniques into practice. From the first, it was recognized that the difficulties of organization in the United States were very great. Such difficulties were variously attributed to the size of the country, the diversity of races, religions, and national origins, the patriotic spirit innate in the majority of Americans, the opportunities for self-improvement offered by an expanding capitalist system. To this, the secretary of the London Fabian Society, Edward R. Pease, who had no love in his heart for America, added contemptuously, quote, "European countries with their great capitals have developed national brains. America, like the lower organisms, has ganglia for various purposes in various parts of its gigantic frame." Whew, that's harsh. The task of Fabian socialism in America was to discover means of transmitting self-destructive impulses to those hidden ganglia. By announcing its own apparent demise and voluntarily going underground at a well-chosen moment, the Fabian socialist movement in America, steered and manipulated with cold-blooded determination by British Fabians, has succeeded in outliving its founders and in becoming an integral, potent, and progressively more deadly tool of the international socialist movement. The future was forecast by William Dean Howells in words that seem more ominous today than when they were spoken. Asked, "What are the prospects for socialism in America?" Howells replied, "As to that, who can say? One sees the movement advancing all around him, and yet it may be years before its ascendancy. On the other hand, it may be but a short time. A slight episode may change history, a turn here or a turn there, and we may find our nation headlong on the road to the ideal commonwealth." Howell's statement was made in February 1898. History has proved that Fabian socialism in America, wearing the silk hat of respectability, did not end there. It was only the beginning. And that is the end of Chapter 10. Chapter 11 next. How about that? What do you think? I'm enjoying my typical live stream nose itch. But quite an important chapter, I think, telling us how they were doing things out in the open, and then suddenly they realized they had to disappear and they had to go underground. And so I thought that last bit there, that they had all the encyclopedias updated to say that the society ended and was no more. But I think her point about history bearing out their plans and their schemes and their existence is a really crucial one. The thing about conspiracy and reading and researching these kinds of topics is that these narratives often make more sense of where we are at as a society and as a people than the conventional view of history that you get on like the History Channel or in your BBC documentaries. And the idea that this group would go underground and then continue to operate with this slow, plodding gradualism, not affiliated with any political party, as we just learned, happy to go on inside either side of the political spectrum, just as long as the policies are being pushed. And this is why the image of a pendulum is so perfect to describe the political system we live in now, because it swings from left to right to left to right. And all the while, it's also moving forward, right? So there's this kind of illusion that it's swinging from left to right, but it's kind of also moving in a specific direction as well, very gradually, almost imperceptibly. And that's the totalitarian tiptoe. That is the tortoise-like gradualism put in motion by these kinds of people. And I think the nationalization of things is also a really critical point to dwell on, that they'll use whatever appeals to the people that they're focused on. They're not of any political side, left or right. They're also, and I keep saying they're atheists because I feel like the core group of Fabians have to have this. They're so invested in amassing wealth and power and control here in this life that I just can't imagine they have any kind of spiritual dimension to their lives. But I don't think they mind working with or among religious people. Well, that's been borne out by the last 2 chapters. So they can be atheists, they can be religious, they can be left or right politically, but they all seem to be of a certain income level. And there seems to be a lot of them who don't want to work and just want to live off the inherited wealth that's passed on to either them or their wives. So that's quite a tell. And they want to sell themselves as the people's people. Like they care about the little people. They care about you and your life, and they want to make things better for you. When actually, I think they just want to make things better for themselves. That's kind of the sense I'm getting. So, what do you think about that chapter? Any quotes? Any revelations or insights gleaned? I'll have a quick look at the YouTube chat. Psychic dogs was the last point I think we mentioned. Frank Lennon says nationalism equals doublespeak. Yeah. So people think that they're protecting and caring for their country and their culture, but actually what they're being pulled into is a monopolization where their individual ability to start and run a business and gain some sort of autonomy in life through entrepreneurship, that's taken away. And instead what you're left with is, well, you can either work for the fat bloated bureaucracy of the state or one of the industries that the state owns and controls, which is so essentially the same thing. So they think that it's about patriotism and preserving the culture for the future generations. Not that nationalism. It's the other nationalism where we're going to nationalize everything, strip away your ability to earn a decent life and to gather resources and wealth to pass on to your children, for example. CESP says it's worse than theft. Frank says, if one's country has a written constitution, such needs to be guarded jealously and intensely protected. Wise words. And Frank says, wow, there's your infiltration. I think that was in reference to their willingness to work inside any political party or any political group. Immune to PR says it explains how Labour politicians fail up. Yeah, what is it about these politicians who, no matter what they do, no matter what schemes and scams and controversies they're embroiled in, yeah, my dog hates Labour politicians as well, by the sounds of it. But no matter what they do, they still have a job to come back to. Like in the case of Tony Blair, still has global lucrative speaking engagements all over the place and is still hailed and rolled out occasionally on television and talk shows and whatnot. It's just sick. It is really sick. So we'll have a quick look at Odyssey. Nothing new going on in the chat there. And Rumble, nothing new going on in the chat there either. Still good though. I think everyone is just so steeped in information that they're chewing on it and thinking it over. And I'm sure this is going to get juicier as we move forward. I didn't realize that it was going to rewind right back to the late 1800s again, because that's where the British section of the book started, and it took us up to kind of World War II. I thought the timeline would pick up from there, but then, that was kind of silly of me to assume that, because the book was written in 1966, so it wouldn't have given us that much time to cover. So she's gone back and kind of she's giving us the story in parallel. So we've had the British side of it, timeline, and now we've gone back to that late 1800s and we're getting what was going on in America. And so they're using authors, they're using preachers, they are spreading this idea of nationalism. They're appealing to women, getting women involved, pushing sort of equality. And it's all being done on the face of it for the good reasons for the average person. But their sinister plan is actually hidden and not, well, it's not that hidden though, is it really? That magazine, the American Fabian, I was like, it's incredible what he put in that magazine. But I think by the 1900s, I think at that point they realized, okay, we're going to have to hide this now. We're going to have to be a little bit more candid. I'm just looking quickly if there's any copies of the American Fabian online. It'd be so good to get those first two. It doesn't look like it. That was just a quick search on eBay. It doesn't seem to have turned any up. They'd be really good to look out for, though. I mean, they're over 100 years old now, so they're probably falling to bits and very hard to find. But those early copies of the American Fabian, they would be really good to get hold of and preserve and look after. So yeah, we're seeing this kind of very sly, very canny, manipulative, sort of psychopathic, because it's all built on lies and misdirection, isn't it? And they really want to remove people's ability to provide for themselves and their loved ones. And they want to manufacture this situation where everybody is dependent upon the state. Now, whether or not they've been successful, you've got to look at what's happened over the last, 120 years. Have more and more people become dependent on the state? Are more and more people in need of that handout from mummy, daddy, government for whatever it is, the way they live their lives and the choices that they make? I kind of would argue that, yes, we're heading into a situation where more and more and more and more people are dependent upon the state. So I kind of feel like the history and what has happened bears out the suggestion that these guys have executed their plans and we're living through the fruits of their labor. So what do you think? Let me know. But I think at that point is a good place to end the stream for this evening. Awaken Your Mind is here. Good evening. Psychic Clever Dog. Yes. Unfortunately, this is the last night that I will be streaming with my dog in the other room because we're sending her back tomorrow to my mother's house. So she won't be here to chime in. There, she's saying good night to you right there. She won't be here to chime in on Saturday. She might be saying, don't take me home. I prefer living here. I'm not sure. I haven't quite learned to speak dog yet. Plus, she's from Romania. So that's another dialect of dog that I haven't learned to speak. And maybe one day in the future. We'll see. All right. So I think I'm going to wrap it up there. We're going to be back on Saturday with another 2 chapters. We have got chapter 11, which is The Professor Goes to Washington. I don't know which professor that is. And we got chapter 12, which is called The Perfect Friendship. So stay tuned for that. Keep an eye out. In the meantime, I'm going to make we've got the shorter clips on the channel, which you can share around and maybe get people interested in the stream and help them catch up faster instead of watching the previous 4 parts in their entirety. Those shorter clips that I made will help give a good background to what we're going to be learning next. And nothing else further to announce, really. That's all I got to say for tonight. So enjoy yourselves. Take care of yourselves and each other. Enjoy the weather if it's good where you are, and the warmth and the sunshine. Get as much of that sunshine as you can. I will be doing that. And have a lovely Friday. Friday is always a good day. It's usually feel good on Friday, isn't it? And I shall see you at the same time, 7 p.m. Saturday night. So take it easy. And until then, God bless.